All right, and not only does the free market automatically penalize discrimination the way I've just defined it, it does it in exactly the right proportion, commensurate with how much or how bad the discrimination is. All right, so for example, if somebody hires his brother-in-law over some other candidate, most people would say, okay, he shouldn't be beheaded. All right, that would be a punishment exceeding what the crime was. Right, so there should be some fine or there should be some sort of punishment, but you don't want to cut the guy's head off for doing that. And so if you start thinking, okay, well, how should we gauge it? And again, it should have something to do with, well, how gross was the nepotism in this case, right? If the two candidates were pretty similar in their productivity, but he gave a slight preference for his brother-in-law, even though the guy maybe wasn't quite as qualified, then he should be fined, but not that much, right? Whereas if you had two candidates and one person was just a top-flight candidate, it was clear he had all the degrees from the right universities, and the other guy was just a complete hack, and he was just hiring this guy because he's my religion and I don't like this other guy. Well, then people might say, well, his fine should be heavier in that case because that's just an extremely biased, prejudiced decision. Whereas the guy who hired his brother-in-law, if it was really close, maybe he wasn't even conscious of what he was doing. All right, so you can see that, again, if you try to push these people to say, well, what would your ideal system do? How would it handle cases like these? Again, it would focus on discrimination in terms of behavior where the firm's bottom line would be best served by hiring the one candidate and then you, for some reason, choose the other one. And again, the punishment ideally would be commensurate with, well, how bad was the bias? These two candidates that you were choosing between, how close were they? How far apart were they? And again, and that seems pretty reasonable, but of course you can imagine I'm setting it up to show you that's exactly what happens in a pure, unregulated free market. Right? That just think about it. You've got two candidates. One of them, all things considered, would bring in $100,000 to the firm. The other candidate would bring in $110,000 to the firm. All right, and let's say the salary you're going to pay is $85,000, and so the employer knows that if he hires the candidate who brings in less, then he's automatically losing out on that extra money that he could have had. All right, so it's not a fine in the sense that it's money taken from his bank account, but it's potential income that he could have had. Right, that this candidate, the qualified one, would have given him $35,000 or whatever the numbers work out to be, and the other one would have only given him $10,000. And so by hiring the one because he looks like me or I don't like Muslims or whatever the reason is that he's not hiring the more qualified candidate, then he is effectively leaving money on the table there. Okay, so in a free market, employers are fined for practicing discrimination as we've defined it, and I think most people agree that's the way we ought to be defining what we're talking about. And not only that, it's exactly in proportion to how bad the discrimination is. And the beauty of this is that you don't need to have inspectors going out and trying to find it. This happens automatically, just the way we've thought about it and we realized what would happen. Anytime an employer does that, automatically, if he hires somebody who's less qualified because of truly irrelevant characteristics, then that's potential profit he could have been earning that he's now not getting because of his bias. All right, and that happens automatically. He doesn't need to be caught by his shareholders. It doesn't need to, someone doesn't need to go through the books and then realize after the fact and go back and rectify it. It happens automatically. He's leaving money on the table. Okay, so that's just one example. Now, when you say something like that, people who are dead set against that mentality, they could be nodding their heads but thinking, okay, this is crazy. Yeah, you made a nice little argument there, and I'm not sure exactly where the mistake in your logic is, but I know you're wrong. That's wrong. I mean, just open your eyes, look around, even the United States, let alone the rest of the world, and do you mean to tell me with a straight face that there's not injustice out there, that there aren't huge disparate income or outcomes that seem to fall on certain groups who happen to also be unpopular, and you're telling me that that's just fine, that no, those people are all, they're getting a fair deal? And no, in general, I would say no, that's not what I'm saying, but the problem is not with the free market. Okay, so one thing is we don't have a free market. So it's always difficult to argue like this because it sounds like you're defending the status quo when that's not really the case. And so, for example, in government projects, like if the government wants to build a building or do anything like that where they put it out for bids, as I think Tom Woods even talked about earlier, there are certain regulations in place that had to do with the union movement so that, for example, you have to pay the prevailing wages when they put out a bid. I think it goes back to the Davis-Bacon Act, when the government puts out a bid for a contract, it can't just give it to the low bidder, again assuming that the person seems reputable and they can do the job. It's not allowed to do that if the bid is so low that it's less than the prevailing wages would dictate. And that goes back to what it's, I mean, this is historical record. The senators and people who voted for this act were clearly racist, and that was their motivation. They were saying we're afraid of, I mean, this was back in the early 1900s, they're saying we were afraid of colored labor coming up and competing with white unions, and it would demoralize wage rates and things like that. So they were worried about, you've got these white unions, and the government's bidding on projects, and then we've got all these, what they were calling colored workers coming up from the South, and they're saying we could do that job, we can build that building for 50% of what these white unions are charging you. And so the government, it didn't want to blatantly just say, no, we're going to give it to the white union, because that would be obvious. And so instead they passed this act which said the government is not allowed to pay less than some fraction of the prevailing wages in the region, which of course would include the wages that these white union workers were getting. All right, so it was a subtle way to funnel tax dollars into the hands of politically powerful unions who happen to be made up of white people, and then these black contractors couldn't get the work. All right, so that was certainly racism, that was institutionalized racism, and yet that probably is a feather in the cap of the labor movement to say, look at this great thing that we did in American history. And if you heard about the Davis-Bacon Act in your schools, I'm sure most people probably would not point to that and say this was an example of institutionalized racism. And again, but you can go read the quotes, and some of this is in my book, of the people when they passed it, what they were saying in defense of it. So I'm not just speculating as to what their motives must have been. You can see what their arguments were. Okay, so that's one example. A different topic that people talk about a lot, and when I mentioned the book, has to do with salary. So you hear anytime a professional athlete is complaining about his pay, and you always get letters to the editor saying things like, here we've got these prima donnas, and what does this guy do? He throws a little white ball really fast at a catcher, and he gets millions of dollars, whereas our math teachers in high school only get $40,000 a year, whatever they get paid. And where are our nation's priorities? Right? That's the sort of thing you hear all the time, and that we as a nation are just discussing that how can we not give more to our teachers than to the professional athletes. Now, it's interesting because part of what we're doing today is just to tell you how bad your teaching has been, and so you might say, well, maybe that's why. But so let's just think about that a little bit. Now, the best analogy or counterexample to that